Well, Bettina, you have managed to be in the news quite frequently recently, and it's a year since the Sproul Hall and other FSM activities. Perhaps we could talk a little today about where you think it has come to in terms of the student movement, how you yourself feel about your election as one of the 3 undergraduate student reps to the Campus Rules Committee, and also about your announcement of your political affiliation. I just would like it to be a general conversation about the things that have been concerning you and therefore have come of concern to other people. Where shall we begin? Shall we begin with your own political alignment? In your own view, how did you come to this political affiliation? I mean, people say, well, her father is a communist. Well, now, my father was a Republican, and I am not. So, do you feel this was an individual adventure of your own, and if so, how was it arrived at?
Well, in part, I think it was. I have to mention that my father started out as a Republican, also supporting Hoover in the 1930s. But he insists that was just to be rebellious against his parents, who were Democrats. At any rate, I think it was a combination of things. One obvious and basic thing is growing up in a family which is communist, that is affiliated to the Communist Party. And while my parents never imposed their views on me, they never hesitated to discuss them in front of me, and this naturally would leave an imprint of discussions politically at home. Also, a big impact on me was living through the McCarthy period, and knowing that somehow my father was different than other people's fathers, and generally having a great deal of respect, particularly as I grew older, for the courage which he showed during that period and his testimony before the McCarthy Committee, and his refusal to give in even 1 inch to McCarthy when I witnessed a lot of people giving in to that kind of thing. Therefore, from that point of view, obviously his politics and the principles which he indicated meant a great deal to him, and that kind of thing left a great impact on me. By the time I got into high school, the second year I was in high school, I had an opportunity to travel to Europe, which was the first time I'd been outside of the American continent, and that left a major impact on me. We went, this was 1959, and we went all through Europe, both the capitalist countries, England and France and Holland and West Germany, and then the socialist countries, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union. And here again, despite being only 15 at the time, this left a big impression in terms of the differences in the 2 countries, and in terms of the fact that I had the opportunity to travel through socialist countries quite on my own. I used to take off and just bubble my way through Moscow or Leningrad on subways and buses and so forth, and meet with other young people that I sought out. And through that experience, certainly became convinced that most of what was being said about the socialist countries was not true. That is, what was being said in this country, and that people were not in terror, and there was great activity and incentive and building and struggle and so forth, and one could not simply write off the socialist world, and that had a deep impact. Just to say that after that experience, those coupled together, I did a great deal of reading on my own. And I read a lot of American socialists and also the classical works of Marxism. And I did that, and by the way, used to argue at great length with my father about different things, and particularly what I was learning in high school and this kind of thing from a historical point of view. so that I would test my own intellect and reach my own conclusions. By the time I had finished high school and had also at that point been active politically, non-affiliated, but I'd been active in the civil rights movement, and I'd been in a couple of peace demonstrations and been attacked by the police a couple of times and so forth. Coupled with my reading and my own feelings and so forth, I became convinced of the possibilities and the fruitfulness of socialism as a social system, and also the viability and enlightening point of view that Marxism held. I still by no means have all the answers, but I had enough of the answers at that point to decide that I could, in good conscience and on my own initiative, become a member of the Communist Party, and I'm still in the process of learning a great deal.
By common consent of both its friends and its enemies, I believe the Communist Party can fairly be said to be a very small minority in this country, politically speaking. What about the Communist Party makes you feel that it is viable and worth affiliating with, as apart from the numerous other movements of protest and change which are current among younger people today?
Well, I think that question has several parts to it.
It has,
and,
indeed. Take them as you wish. Sorry.
The first thing I would just like to indicate is that in terms of the Communist Party being a minority, there's no question but that it is. Although I think some people who disagree with it politically, who are on the left or on the liberal part of the left, tend to try to minimize the influence of the party and say that it is a minority, which it is, but tend to make it much more of a minority than it actually is. What I wanted to indicate in terms of that is that the party has gone through, since World War II, a very difficult period. One of the remarkable things I find to be is the fact that it's still in existence, still has an office, still has officers, still has something like 10,000 members in this country, and still functions. Not least of what it went through was the period of McCarthyism, and a tendency of a great many people on the left to cave into it. I think that's one thing, and a very big thing, and the fact that the Communist Party never did cave in to McCarthyism. That's not to say that non-communists, all non-communists caved in. Of course they didn't. There was great resistance in this country, but the party held out. And the other thing is that the party itself made errors and mistakes in judgment during the period of McCarthyism. I happen to think personally that one of the biggest ones was misjudging what stage of American democracy we were in the 1950s, and making a political judgment that at the height of McCarthyism and after the execution of the Rosenbergs, we were on the verge of fascism in this country. And while I can see the logic for arriving at such a political conclusion, I think it was a wrong conclusion to draw, and did not really clearly estimate the deep-rooted democratic traditions of the American people and the deep-rooted resistance of the American people to fascism. One of the things that this led to, this conclusion that we were on the verge of fascism, was the party essentially going underground and not taking the kind of public role that it should have taken. And one of the results of that was people leaving it in droves, who were not prepared to take up that kind of resistance in terms of an underground movement, and also who didn't agree, probably, with that political conclusion. Those are only two things, but I mean to indicate that there were certain objective and subjective conditions in this country which led to the party coming to be a very, very small group of people. Since about 1960, the party began to rebuild and stopped losing members and began to recruit people. The greatest impact that the party has had has been among the youth. which is a perfectly logical thing in connection with the fact that the most active part of the movement in the country, both the whole movement, civil rights, peace, and so forth, have been among young people. They have been the people in motion and in action, people seeking change and challenging what exists and so forth. So it would make sense that the party would have its greatest influence among young people. I think, in terms of the viability of the party, or why one would think it viable, because in my view, the party's position is correct. That is, its general estimation, its general outlook, its general approach to politics and to social change. Generally, there are mistakes. I'm not trying to say we have all the answers, but that generally it has what I think is a solid approach, and one which, as it becomes known and as people understand what communists stand for, will begin to attract more and more people. And again, I'm optimistic, I think, among the youth, which, after all, are the future of this country. At the same time, I'd like to point out that I think that the developments among the youth in general, say trends in the New Left that you mentioned, SDS as a good example, the development of the Du Bois Club as another example, all of these things are tremendously healthy, and I welcome them. I think the party as a whole welcomes this kind of movement. It has a great creativity, great initiative, great spirit, and it's a tremendous thing. There's nothing that makes the existence of the Communist Party as an independent organization incompatible with the development of a new left. And in fact, I think the two tend to help each other and offer each other different viewpoints and create a whole new dialogue within the left, which is a very important thing in terms of arriving at political conclusions which are viable. The other, just to point out, I think the party in recent years made one of its greatest contributions in 1960, when I think it was the first political organization in this country, probably before anyone else, that pointed to the danger of neo-fascism and the danger of the ultra-right as embodied in the Goldwater outlook. That it pointed to this very early and called for the most massive, united effort of everybody from the liberal center all the way over to the left to counter this rising Goldwaterism. And that the estimate of the party was certainly proven by the nomination of Goldwater in '64 in the Republican Convention, thereby indicating a rather substantial shift to the right for the Republican Party and the seizure by the Goldwater rights of rather substantial sections of the Republican Party. I think the party, that is the Communist Party, recognized this, argued it, and in every way possible, working day and night for several years, mobilized every possible effort to counter the Republican Goldwater-type ascendancy. Again, on this question, I think the party made tactical errors, which I would disagree with. For example, in the '64 elections, I don't think we were critical enough of Johnson. And that's something that I've had qualms about ever since Johnson got into escalating into Vietnam. But be that as it may, the strategy, the outlook, the approach of a united effort against Goldwaterism and the ultra-right, I think, was substantially correct, and I think we made a good contribution.
Earlier on, you said, gave us one of the reasons why the communists were wrong about the rise of fascism, the deep-rooted democratic tradition in this country. Now, that is an argument which is used frequently as being the one reason why the American people would not accept the communist philosophy, because it also is an undemocratic form. What would you say to that? Is it as big a barrier to the rise of communism as it was to the rise of fascism?
Well, I don't think so. In fact, I think the deep-rooted democratic traditions which I spoke of is probably the most attractive feature of the Communist Party and its outlook and approach. And actually fundamental to the program and approach of the Communist Party. And fundamental to American people understanding what communists stand for and what socialism is all about is the question of democracy and what the Communist Party's position is in relation to democracy. I don't think any other aspect of socialism has been so distorted by the American ruling class as the question of democracy under socialism.
And what do you feel it signifies?
Right, that's the obvious next point. My own feeling is that when one talks about socialism, one is talking about the quintessence of democracy. And that doesn't mean anything because it's abstract, so maybe if we get it down to concrete terms, it would make more sense. I recently did a study of the university. As a result of my involvement in the FSM and so forth, I got interested in just how the university was controlled. And as a result of finding out the vast hierarchy that controls the university, and in addition to that, the corporate wealth which is involved in the control of the university, not only the University of California, I'm specifically referring to that, but all colleges and universities in this country, one gets into the question of, well, how would you change the university? And fundamental to changing the university, to make it better, to make the education more creative for the students involved in it, and more creative for faculty members, to truly make the university free, one would have to go about eliminating the corporate control of the university. And if one is talking about socialism, that is precisely what someone is talking about, precisely what I'm talking about. So that, for example, one would democratize the university under socialism. One would seek to make administrators purely administrative, not making policy. One would seek to get the faculty and students and people out in the outside world to be participants in the planning of the curriculum of the university and of the purpose of the university, the courses to be taken, the research projects to be undertaken. And it would be in terms of people themselves. For example, you have a course on Negro history. We don't now at the university, but let's say we did have a course on Negro history. Well, who knows better Negro history than the Negro people themselves? I think that they know it, and they know what they have endured, probably better than any white person, simply because they have been the oppressed. Then, for example, would it not be conceivable and possible, and in fact enlightening, to have a course on Negro history, the curriculum for which is developed by a staff of faculty in that field, and students, and members of the Negro community? Would it not be enlightening to have a course, let us say, in labor history, which involves a curriculum established by faculty and students, and also involves members of the working class to participate in the writing of such a curriculum, proposals for what it should encompass, and so forth. And I think that this type of thing might be applied to many different fields, including in the sciences, where you have people that are actually scientists in the real world that would participate in the writing and the development of such curriculum. That type of thing is more or less impossible under capitalism, or particularly under this system today. That type of thing is revolutionary in its concept in terms of what the role of the university should be. It is revolutionary, I think, and I could expand it beyond that in terms of eliminating regential control over university affairs and so forth. It is revolutionary, and it is also, I think, much more democratic than what exists in the universities today. This is just one example of what I think one would be talking about in terms of democracy under socialism.
Well, do you feel that the communist philosophy is then capable of responding to different types of environment in different ways, because I don't assume, or I would like your clarification, where communism has come to power through the efforts of a minority in non-democratic countries, there has not been available to any government, communist or non-communist, a democratic process or a people educated to utilize the democratic process. Do you feel that the communist philosophy, as you understand it, is capable of adaptation to the situation in which it finds itself? Because you keep talking about democracy, and this is so diametrically opposed to what most people conceive of as the dictatorship of communism that I would like your comments on it.
Right. Well, the first thing is that anywhere in the world where socialism exists, and anywhere in the world where a Marxist outlook, a Marxist view of society has been applied, it has to be applied, and where it hasn't, there have been grave errors committed. It's got to adapt to the traditions and the background of the people to which it is going to come into existence. I think one of the great things about this country is precisely the democratic tradition that this country has, which probably no other country in the world has, to the extent that we did, and certainly the socialist countries today never had anything resembling the constitutional process and the democratic process which this country has. It's one of the things that gets me so excited when I start thinking about the possibilities of socialism in this country. Yes, the answer to the question is yes. The communist philosophy or socialism easily and has to adapt to the country in which it's taking place. The other important thing about it is that it is my opinion and a principled point with me that in this country there will never be socialism unless the overwhelming majority of the American people passionately want it, and want it so badly that they're going to go out and get it. It won't be superimposed, and it won't come from above. It's got to come from below. It's got to come from what people want and go out and get. And otherwise, and part of that, in terms of democracy, is important. Anyone who lived through the FSM perhaps can understand this better. I had never lived through anything like it. But people constantly referred to the spirit which enveloped the campus at the time of the FSM. And many people have referred to the FSM as a revolution. Well, I don't think it was quite a revolution. I think it was a good, solid revolt. It didn't fundamentally change what existed at the university. Nevertheless, there was a certain spirit which captured the campus, which involved an overwhelming majority of the students and the faculty, and which was of the essence democratic. Decisions were made in a democratic way. The principle of the fight for the FSM was for democratic rights. The whole thing just swept everybody off its feet in terms of the spirit which it engendered. And I think that one can almost imagine in one's mind a revolutionary situation involving not simply one campus, but an entire nation, an entire people, in which there are certain principles which they over a period of time have developed themselves and articulated themselves and passionately desire, which makes each and every one of them a crucial part to the revolutionary process, to bringing about that change. And that in itself is a tremendous democratic concept, a tremendous democratic upsurge. And I just draw the parallel with the FSM only from that point.
And where do you think, to pull it down to that level, how do you feel it has developed since the acute crisis of a year ago? Do you feel that this democratic process and this process toward change is continuing and is continuing in a democratic and healthy way?
I think it's continuing, and I think that the situation on the campus is just incomparable to what existed now, I suppose, a little more than a year ago, since it's after the sit-in. The first thing is that obviously the whole idea of rewriting the ASUC Constitution, the whole idea of a joint faculty student administration committee to promulgate regulations.
And this is the committee to which you've just been elected,
right,
is it
the
not?
Campus
Yes.
Rules Committee. The whole idea of both of those things are a direct outgrowth of the FSM. And I think that they are important procedures for institutionalizing what the FSM has won, let us say, de facto, and very important. I think, in particular, this thing around the Constitutional Convention is awfully important, because for the first time since the 1950s, students are writing their own Constitution, and we're going to vote it in after it's written. I have no question but that once all the discussion has gone on and the Constitution is written, it will be fully and overwhelmingly ratified by the students on the campus. And one of the fundamental things about that Constitution is that that student government will be independent of either the state or the local administration, and that it will make decisions for the students, and that it will truly be a government of, by, and for the students, and not a government where President Kerr can veto anything he doesn't like, which comes through the ASUC. I think it'll make student government much more meaningful. The same thing, to a lesser extent, I think is true of the Campus Rules Committee, although I have some forebodings of having another fight before those rules are actually accepted. But there again, the basic principles of the FSM, in terms of freedom of speech on the campus, and in terms of who writes the regulations to govern student political activity, I think that the Campus Rules Committee has a major role to play in that.
Would you like to talk a little, Bettina, about how you interpret your own election to this body? Because I believe, if I'm correct, that it has been a number of years since anyone who was an avowed communist has been elected to almost anything.
Yes, that's true. In fact, I'm told that the last communist ever elected was in 1946, and I think that's when his term expired, and that was Benjamin J. Davis, who was a Negro attorney in New York who won a city council seat. I think I would interpret the election to mean the following, that I think that the students on the campus respected the fact that I disclosed my membership in the Communist Party, and the fact that I did it, and the timing of it, the fact that I didn't do it at a time when it would have hurt the FSM or would have hurt the movement on the campus. I think they respected that. I think that the election simply means that they know from a year's experience what my position is, and what I have said over and over and over again at rallies and at meetings and in jail when we had our discussions there, and that they are confident that what I said I stood for, I do stand for and will fight for in the Campus Rules Committee, and that in essence my position was the embodiment of the principles of the FSM. I think they voted for me, if I might say this, in spite of my politics, rather than because of my politics. And I think that, frankly, I think that I don't deserve to be congratulated for the election. I think the students on the campus deserve the congratulations for having the courage to vote for someone on the basis of issues and on the basis of what that person said she stood for, and not on the basis of red baiting and political affiliation.
But don't you, or do you feel that there was also in that vote some element of an announcement by that generation of students that these are the ways they are going to make up their minds, and that the fact that someone is or is not a communist is a matter of, I gather, considerable indifference to many of them? In other words,
yes.
that they are interested in the issues rather than the political labels, and that this is in some degree typical of the attitude of the whole student generation.
I think to a certain extent that's true. I would put that in two ways. One is that I think the way I described it was sort of a collective spit in red baiting's face, which I think is what that vote symbolized. But the other aspect to that is that while there may be what you would term indifference to the fact that I'm a communist, I think it's indifference in terms of a protest against red baiting and against the crucifixion of people for what other people say they stand for. I have noted a tremendous interest in what my views are, an interest which was not as acute before it was generally known that I was a communist. People constantly now, we're trying now to develop forums and so forth where we can have informal discussions and gatherings on the campus. There is a tremendous interest in what a communist stands for and what the position of the Communist Party is in this country on everything from eggs to soup, or nuts to soup, I guess the expression. So I would estimate it that way.
Well, one of the things that I have noticed in interviewing people of your generation and listening to them, I guess KPFA has recorded a large percentage of what they've had to say, is what I might call a pragmatic approach to what's going on around them, and a sort of contempt almost for the very highly formalized political positions and cliches and so on of their elders. And I, in spite of the fact that by your interpretation, a very structured thing like the Communist Party, which is a very highly structured political manifestation, it somehow is able to live at peace, apparently, with what appears to be one of the most unstructured political situations, namely the situation on the campuses in general, where by and large, the students, it appears to me, are extremely open. They're very pragmatic, but also very open and very averse to the idea of being too structured in their approach to what's going on in the world around them. Does that confirm in any way your own experience?
Yes and no.
Right.
In this sense, I think that certainly in the recent past, the most successful organizations of students, and it's been primarily of students, have been things like the FSM, or another thing I would give as an example, the VDC, because they have been unstructured. That is, there's been no real formal leadership, although in the FSM there was a de facto leadership which developed. But open meetings and very free-for-all and all kinds of ideas circulating and so forth. And I think that part of that unstructured character to the movement, and it is unstructured in a certain sense, is what you would characterize as a pragmatic approach to politics. That is, you find the issue, and you get yourself what I would term an ad hoc committee around the issue, and you go out and change it. And then you win that battle, and then the next issue comes up, and sometimes the issues are a little more prolonged. The FSM was rather short-term. The VDC, I think, is going to be a little longer-term fight. Now, I think one of the things that happens is, I think that kind of unstructured movement and ad hoc basis is good for a certain period in history and a certain period of struggle. My own feeling is that the movement itself, quite apart from the Communist Party, will find a need for greater structure as the movement becomes or finds itself dealing with fundamental problems in American society, and also as the struggles become more prolonged. So that while you have an ad hoc structure to a certain extent, I think after a while you will begin to have a more structured type of movement. I think that will come out of political necessity. And another thing I would indicate is that this movement, while terrific, and I'm not trying to demean it in any way, has not yet developed a positive program for America. It has limited itself almost exclusively to protest. The ruling class does something atrocious, and there is a response. To a limited extent, the civil rights movement, which I think, by the way, is much more structured than any of the other movements, because it's existed longer, has already begun to develop a certain program. And I think that that becomes a necessity. Once we end the war in Vietnam, if we do, there's going to be the whole question of what the program of the peace movement is in this country. How does one go about preventing other wars of a colonial nature in which the United States intervenes in the internal affairs of another country? How does one go about planning a political program which brings about demilitarization and disarmament in this country? That is a more positive and long-term view of things. And I think that that type of thing, in one sense, is pragmatic, and in another sense, takes on a more structured form. The only other thing I'd like to say is that I think perhaps a misconception among some people in the movement is that structure somehow inhibits creativity, somehow inhibits ideas, and I don't think that that's true necessarily.
Well, it has proven one of the dangers in the world's history.
Of?
That that structuring ultimately tends to limit creativity, perhaps not in the opening stages.
It depends on how it's done and who's involved in it and so forth. I can think of specific examples, just to throw this out. I remember some of those ghastly meetings of the FSM, which were ghastly because they were so unstructured, and where you would go on all night, and 50, 60, 70% of what was transacted that evening was irrelevant. And it took, and at the same time...
I think that's a low estimate.
It was a great experience. Yeah, I remember steering committee meetings where we would have philosophy discussions until 2 a.m. and then plan our political program for the next day about what we were going to do, which on one hand is a very exciting type of thing to participate in, and on the other hand is exhausting and doesn't really move the movement forward. In a practical thing. I just wanted to point out in terms of structured approach, it's not necessarily inhibiting of ideas.
Well, in one sense, I suppose you might say that things like the Campus Rules Committee and the Constitutional Convention are the beginning of structuring of what began with the unstructured movement that was known as FSM.
I would agree with that, right. And the institutionalizing
just
of
as
the
you
FSM.
note that the civil rights thing has grown up, and certainly the peace movement, if I judge it correctly on the basis of the innumerable things about peace which come through this place, is also struggling to know where it goes from here. And
the only thing on the peace movement, one thing that does concern me, just to mention it, is while I think it has to develop what I classified as a positive approach and so forth, I think that right now we have our hands filled ending the war, and I hope that we concentrate our initiative and our creativity and our thoughts to precisely how we're going to do that.
Is there anything else on any of these points that you would like to say something about, Bettina?
Well, just I'd like to say something about the one thing which has come up and which is related to the question of democracy, which we touched on before. And I think that I will have a letter which will appear in the Daily Californian on this subject. But I don't know whether or not this program will be on before or after. But anyway, I would like to say something about this controversy which has come up ever since my father appeared last on the campus, and that is in relation to the Abram Torts case, if I could say something about that.
Yes, you wish.
What I wanted to say about that is that the first thing to be said is that a lot of people in this country, and also people within the movement, and I make it capital M, big movement, are, I think, too quick and too hasty to condemn the Soviet Union, and that it is too easy in this country to condemn it. And that almost makes you, you're okay if every once in a while you protect yourself by condemning the Soviet Union on one or another point. Now, I think that some people have a tendency to do that, and I will not be a party to outright condemnation and repeated condemnation because of pressures to do it. But on the other hand, I think there is a problem also within the movement of people who are honestly critical of the Soviet Union on one or another point, something that they might do. And that as communists and socialists and whatever strain, without being anti-Soviet, there is a responsibility to criticize when criticism is due. And I think in this case criticism is due. It is my own opinion, my own belief, that a writer should not be imprisoned for what he writes. That is an unequivocal statement, and that's sort of said and period. In the case of Mr. Sinyavsky, I do not have all the facts in that case, and I am in the process of gathering them, including finding out just why he was arrested. There again, I think people sort of jump to the conclusion that he was arrested for what he wrote. And if that is true, then I am opposed to the arrest. As I say, I'm investigating that case myself and trying to satisfy my own views as to what took place. I think also, though, on this question of democracy, and I'm still groping, and people are still looking around for what it is. Again, I repeat that unequivocal statement that no writer should be imprisoned for what he writes. There is a question of democracy under socialism as opposed to democracy under capitalism, and whether or not your definition of democracy changes under those two systems, and whether or not under socialism one begins to advance democratic concepts beyond the confines of what I would term bourgeois democracy. So let me give a specific example of something which I'm thinking about, and maybe other people would think about. It seems to me that in this country, one of the most inhibiting features against democracy is racism, is racist literature or racist propaganda. That it is possible to define what you mean by racist. For example, the word nigger is racist. The word kike is racist in character. Propaganda which attempts to portray the Negro as inferior, or the Jew as inferior, for that matter, has been scientifically proven that the Negro is not inferior, and has been well established. Therefore, material which insists upon his inferiority, material which incites to violence against the Negro people, is, I think, and I think a set of standards could be developed which would indicate that such material is racist in character. And I would argue that it is conceivable that the outlawing of racist material in this country, given the fact that you have a set of standards as to what characterizes racist material, would enhance democracy, would end the racist core which exists, particularly in the South, but also in the North, and which covers just everything, from textbooks in school to everything else. And
that's one reason why it would be so hard to define the standards.
Well, I think it would have to be done before you could institute something like this. But I tried to give some examples of what I meant by defining those standards. But I think that that principle of defining what is racist, setting those standards, and then outlawing racist material, not prior censorship, but after it is written, would have a democratizing effect. Now, I say that in the sense that I think that people should think about that.
Of course, you are aware of the classic argument against it, namely that if you put in the hands of government any power to so act, you have, by definition, opened the door to the widening of that power. And the First Amendment position, however much one may regret it in its racist context, and I share that regret, the argument on the other side is very powerful.
Well, just let me indicate that I'm talking about, you see, that's why I raised the question of when you determine when to, I would be opposed, let me put it this way, to today seeking such a thing. That I'm talking about the outlawing of racism. Why? Because we've got enough problems in this country preserving the right of anybody to speak, and because in this country, invariably, it is the left which is suppressed. By the left, I don't mean just communists, but I mean many things on the left in general. But if the movement, if people, after struggle and in a period of change, raise such a demand and define what is meant by racist, then I think one has to take a second look at the demand and at the issue. And I merely say that because it is a question of whether or not, under all circumstances, in all societies, one takes an absolutist view of what we would consider the First Amendment rights. And I am trying to indicate that I do not always take such an absolutist view, and I want that to be perfectly and honestly stated. Right now, I'm not about to argue for such things, but I don't want that to be taken as meaning that I would not in the future possibly argue for such laws. So that I think that one of the reasons I wanted to bring up the Torts case, because it's been on my mind and it's probably been on everybody else's mind. What does she think about that? And I wanted to bring up this question of freedom of speech and so forth. I might add that I have read some of the writings of Meiklejohn, and in one of his books, I think it's Political Freedom of Speech or something like that. In one of Meiklejohn's books, he does raise this question of outlawing of racism and defining it and so forth, and I think it's worth thinking about that someone of Dr. Meiklejohn's stature and known as a civil libertarian would raise such a question, and I think it's food for thought, so to speak.
Thank you very much, Bettina. It's been a very great pleasure to talk to you.